Section 5 of A Far Country by Winston Churchill. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 1, Chapter 5. It was true to my father's character that he should have waited until the day after graduation to discuss my future, if discussion be the proper word. The next evening at supper he informed me that he wished to talk to me in the sitting-room, whither I followed him with a sinking heart. He seated himself at his desk, and sat for a moment gazing at me with a curious and benumbing expression. And then the blow fell. "Hugh, I have spoken to your cousin Robert Breck about you, and he has kindly consented to give you a trial." "To give me a trial, sir?" I exclaimed. "To employ you at a small but reasonable salary." I could find no words to express my dismay. My dreams had come to this, that I was to be made a clerk in a grocery store. The fact that it was a wholesale grocery store was little consolation. "But, father," I faltered, "I don't want to go into business." "Ah!" The sharpness of the exclamation might have betrayed to me the pain in which he was, but he recovered himself instantly, and I could see nothing but an inexorable justice closing in on me mechanically, a blind justice in its inability to read my soul. "The time to have decided that," he declared, "was some years ago, my son. I have given you the best schooling a boy can have, and you have not shown the least appreciation of your advantages. I do not enjoy saying this, Hugh, but in spite of all my efforts, and of those of your mother, you have remained undeveloped and irresponsible. My hope, as you know, was to have made you a professional man, a lawyer, and to take you into my office. My father and grandfather were professional men before me, but you are wholly lacking in ambition." And I had burned with it all my life. "I have ambition," I cried, the tears forcing themselves to my eyes. "Ambition for what, my son?" I hesitated. How could I tell him that my longings to do something, to be somebody in the world, were never more keen than at that moment? Matthew Arnold had not then written his definition of God as the stream of tendency by which we fulfill the laws of our being, and my father, at any rate, would not have acquiesced in the definition. Dimly but passionately I felt then, as I had always felt, that I had a mission to perform, a service to do, which ultimately would be revealed to me. But the hopelessness of explaining this took on, now, the proportions of a tragedy, and I could only gaze at him. "What kind of ambition, Hugh?" he repeated sadly. I have sometimes thought I could write, sir, if I had a chance. I like it better than anything else. I've tried it, and if I could only go to college—" "Literature!" There was in his voice a scandalized tone. "Why not, father?" I asked weakly. And now it was he who, for the first time, seemed to be at a loss to express himself. He turned in his chair, and with a sweep of the hand indicated the long rows of musty-backed volumes. "Here," he said, "you have had at your disposal as well assorted a small library as the city contains, and you have not availed yourself of it. Yet you talk to me of literature as a profession. I am afraid, Hugh, that this is merely another indication of your desire to shun hard work, and I must tell you frankly that I fail to see in you the least qualification for such a career. You have not even inherited my taste for books. I venture to say, for instance, that you have never even read a paragraph of Plutarch, and yet when I was your age I was completely familiar with the Lives. You will not read Scott or Dickens." The impeachment was not to be denied, for the classics were hateful to me. Naturally, I was afraid to make such a damning admission. My father had succeeded in presenting my ambition as the height of absurdity and presumption, and, with something of the despair of a shipwrecked mariner, my eyes rested on the green expanses of those book-backs, Bohn's Standard Library. Nor did it occur to him or to me that one might be great in literature without having read so much as a gritty page of them. He finished his argument by reminding me that worthless persons sought to enter the arts in the search for a fool's paradise, and in order to satisfy a reprehensible craving for notoriety. The implication was clear, that imaginative production could not be classed as hard work, and he assured me that literature was a profession in which no one could afford to be second class, a Longfellow, a Harriet Beecher Stowe, or nothing. This was a practical age and a practical country. We had indeed produced Irvings and Hawthornes, but the future of American letters was, to say the least, problematical. We were a utilitarian people who would never create a great literature, and he reminded me that the days of the romantic and the picturesque had passed. He gathered that I desired to be a novelist. Well, novelists, with certain exceptions, were fantastic fellows who blew iridescent soap bubbles and who had no morals. In the face of such a philosophy as his I was mute. The world appeared a dreary place of musty offices and smoky steelworks, of coal dust, of labour without a spark of inspiration. And that other, the world of my dreams, simply did not exist. Incidentally, my father had condemned Cousin Robert's wholesale grocery business as a refuge of the lesser of intellect that could not achieve the professions, an inference not calculated to stir my ambition and liking for it at the start. I began my business career on the following Monday morning. At breakfast, held earlier than usual on my account, my mother's sympathy was the more eloquent for being unspoken, while my father wore an air of unwonted cheerfulness, charging me when I departed to give his kindest remembrances to my cousin Robert Breck. With a sense of martyrdom somehow deepened by this attitude of my parents, I boarded a horse-car and went downtown. Early though it was, the narrow streets of the wholesale district reverberated with the rattle of trucks and echoed with the shouts of drivers. The day promised to be scorching. At the door of the warehouse of Breck and Company I was greeted by the ineffable smell of groceries, in which the suggestion of parched coffee prevailed. This is the sharpest remembrance of all, and even to-day that odour affects me somewhat in the manner that the interior of a ship affects a person prone to seasickness. My cousin Robert, in his well-worn alpaca coat, was already seated at his desk behind the clouded glass partition next to the alley at the back of the store, and as I entered he gazed at me over his steel-rimmed spectacles with that same disturbing look of clairvoyance I have already mentioned as one of his characteristics. The grey eyes were quizzical, and yet seemed to express a little commiseration. "Well, Hugh, you've decided to honour us, have you?" he asked. "I'm much obliged for giving me the place, Cousin Robert," I replied, but he had no use for that sort of politeness, and he saw through me, as always. "So you're not too tony for the grocery business, eh?" "Oh, no, sir." "It was good enough for old Benjamin Breck," he said. "Well, I'll give you a fair trial, my boy, and no favouritism on account of relationship, any more than to Willie." His strong voice resounded through the store, and presently my cousin Willie appeared in answer to his summons, the same Willie who used to lead me, on mischief bent, through the barns and woods and fields of Claremore. He was barefoot no longer, though freckled still, grown lanky and tall. He wore a coarse blue apron that fell below his knees, and a pencil was stuck behind his ear. "Get an apron for Hugh," said his father. Willie's grin grew wider. "I'll fit him out," he said. "Start him in the shipping department," directed Cousin Robert, and turned to his letters. I was forthwith provided with an apron, and introduced to the slim and anaemic but cheerful Johnny Hedges, the shipping clerk, hard at work in the alley. Secretly I looked down on my fellow clerks, as one destined for a higher mission, made out of better stuff, finer stuff. Despite my attempt to hide this sense of superiority, they were swift to discover it, and perhaps it is to my credit, as well as theirs, that they did not resent it. Curiously enough, they seemed to acknowledge it. Before the week was out, I had earned the nickname of Beau Brummel. "Say, Beau," Johnny Hedges would ask when I appeared of a morning, "what happened in the great world last night?" I had an affection for them, these fellow clerks, and I often wondered at their contentment with the drab lives they led, at their self-congratulation for having a job at Breck and Company's. "You don't mean to say you like this kind of work?" I exclaimed one day to Johnny Hedges, as we sat on barrels of 4X flour looking out at the hot sunlight in the alley. "It ain't a question of liking it, Beau," he rebuked me. "It's all very well for you to talk, since your father's a millionaire." A fiction so firmly embedded in their heads that no amount of denial affected it. "But what do you think would happen to me if I was fired? I couldn't go home and take it easy, you bet not. I just want to shake hands with myself when I think that I've got a home and a job like this. I know a feller, a hard worker he was too, who walked the pavements for 3 months when the Culvers failed and couldn't get nothing, and took to drink, and the last I heard of him he was sleeping in police stations and walking the ties, and his wife's a waitress at a cheap hotel. Don't you think it's easy to get a job?" I was momentarily sobered by the earnestness with which he brought home to me the relentlessness of our civilization. It seemed incredible. I should have learned a lesson in that store. Barring a few discordant days when the orders came in too fast, or when we were short-handed because of sickness, it was a veritable hive of happiness. Morning after morning clerks and porters arrived, pale yet smiling, and laboured with cheerfulness from 8 o'clock until 6, and departed as cheerfully for modest homes in obscure neighbourhoods that seemed to me areas of exile. They were troubled with no visions of better things. When the travelling men came in from the road, there was great hilarity. Important personages, these, looked up to by the city clerks, jolly, reckless, Elizabethan-like rovers, who had tasted of the wine of liberty and of other wines with the ineradicable lust for the road in their blood. No more routine for Jimmy Bowles, who was king of them all. I shudder to think how much of my knowledge of life I owe to this Jimmy, whose stories would have filled a quarto volume, but could on no account have been published. For a self-respecting post office would not have allowed them to pass through the mails. As it was, Jimmy gave them circulation enough. I can still see his round face, with the nose just indicated, his wicked, twinkling little eyes, and I can hear his husky voice fall to a whisper when "the boss" passed through the store. Jimmy, when visiting us, always had a group around him. His audacity with women amazed me, for he never passed one of the lady clerks without some form of caress, which they resented, but invariably laughed at. One day he imparted to me his code of morality. He never made love to another man's wife, so he assured me, if he knew the man. The secret of life he had discovered in laughter, and by laughter he sold quantities of Cousin Robert's groceries. Mr. Bowles boasted of a Catholic acquaintance in all the cities of his district, but before venturing forth to conquer these, he had learned his own city by heart. My cousin Robert was not aware of the fact that Mr. Bowles showed the town to certain customers. He even desired to show it to me, but an Epicurean strain in my nature held me back. Johnny Hedges went with him occasionally, and Henry Schneider, the bill clerk, and I listened eagerly to their experiences, afterwards confiding them to Tom. There were times when, driven by an overwhelming curiosity, I ventured into certain strange streets, alone, shivering with cold and excitement, gripped by a fascination I did not comprehend, my eyes now averted, now irresistibly raised toward the white streaks of light that outlined the windows of dark houses. One winter evening, as I was going home, I encountered at the mailbox a young woman who shot at me a queer, twisted smile. I stood still as though stunned, looking after her, and, when half-way across the slushy street, she turned and smiled again. Prodigiously excited, I followed her, fearful that I might be seen by someone who knew me, nor was it until she reached an unfamiliar street that I ventured to overtake her. She confounded me by facing me. "Get out!" she cried fiercely. I halted in my tracks, overwhelmed with shame, but she continued to regard me by the light of the street lamp. "You didn't want to be seen with me on 2nd Street, did you? You're one of those sneaking swells." The shock of this sudden onslaught was tremendous. I stood frozen to the spot, trembling, convicted, for I knew that her accusation was just. I had wounded her, and I had a desire to make amends. "I'm sorry," I faltered. "I didn't mean to offend you, and you smiled." I got no farther. She began to laugh, and so loudly that I glanced anxiously about. I would have fled, but something still held me, something that belied the harshness of her laugh. "You're just a kid," she told me. "Say, you get along home and tell your mamma I sent you." whereupon I departed in a state of humiliation and self-reproach I had never before known, wandering about aimlessly for a long time. When at length I arrived at home, late for supper, my mother's solicitude only served to deepen my pain. She went to the kitchen herself to see if my mince pie were hot, and served me with her own hands. My father remained at his place at the head of the table while I tried to eat, smiling indulgently at her ministrations. "Oh, a little hard work won't hurt him, Sarah," he said. "When I was his age, I often worked until 11 o'clock and never felt the worse for it. Business must be pretty good, eh, Hugh?" I had never seen him in a more relaxing mood, a more approving one. My mother sat down beside me. Words seem useless to express the complicated nature of my suffering at that moment, my remorse, my sense of deception, of hypocrisy, yes, and my terror. I tried to talk naturally, to answer my father's questions about affairs at the store, while all the time my eyes rested upon the objects of the room, familiar since childhood. Here were warmth, love, and safety. Why could I not be content with them, thankful for them? What was it in me that drove me from these sheltering walls out into the dark places? I glanced at my father. Had he ever known these wild, destroying desires? Oh, if only I could have confided in him! The very idea of it was preposterous. Such placidity as theirs would never understand the nature of my temptations, and I pictured to myself their horror and despair at my revelation. In imagination I beheld their figures receding, while I drifted out to sea alone. Would the tide, which was somehow within me, carry me out and out, in spite of all I could do? Give me that man that is not passion's slave, and I will wear him in my heart's core. I did not shirk my tasks at the store, although I never got over the feeling that a fine instrument was being employed where a coarser one would have done equally well. There were moments when I was almost overcome by surges of self-commiseration and of impotent anger. For instance, I was once driven out of a shop by an incensed German grocer whom I had asked to settle a long-standing account. Yet the days passed, the daily grind absorbed my energies, and when I was not collecting, or tediously going over the stock in the dim recesses of the store, I was running errands in the wholesale district, treading the burning brick of the pavements, dodging heavy trucks and drays and perspiring clerks who flew about with memorandum pads in their hands, or awaiting the pleasure of bank tellers. Save Harvey, the venerable porter, I was the last to leave the store in the evening, and I always came away with the taste on my palate of Breck and Company's mail, it being my final duty to lick the whole of it and deposit it in the box at the corner. The gum on the envelopes tasted of wintergreen. My cousin Robert was somewhat astonished at my application. "We'll make a man of you yet, Hugh," he said to me once, when I had performed a commission with unexpected despatch. Business was his all in all, and he had an undisguised contempt for higher education. To send a boy to college was, in his opinion, to run no inconsiderable risk of ruining him. What did they amount to when they came home, strutting like peacocks, full of fads and fancies and much too good to associate with decent, hard-working citizens? Nevertheless, when autumn came and my friends departed with éclat for the East, I was desperate indeed. Even the contemplation of Robert Breck did not console me, and yet here, in truth, was a life which might have served me as a model. His store was his castle, and his reputation for integrity and square dealing as wide as the city. Often I used to watch him with a certain envy as he stood in the doorway, his hands in his pockets, and greeted fellow merchant and banker with his genuine and dignified directness. This man was his own master. They all called him Robert, and they made it clear by their manner that they knew they were addressing one who fulfilled his obligations and asked no favours. Crusty old Nathaniel Durrett once declared that when you bought a bill of goods from Robert Breck, you did not have to check up the invoice or employ a chemist. Here was a character to mould upon. If my ambition could but have been bounded by Breck and Company, I too might have come to stand in that doorway, content with a tribute that was greater than Caesar's. I had been dreading the Christmas holidays, which were indeed to be no holidays for me, and when at length they arrived, they brought with them from the East certain heroes fashionably clad, citizens now of a larger world than mine. These former companions had become superior beings. They could not help showing it, and their presence destroyed the balance of things. For, alas, I had not wholly abjured the feminine sex after all, and from being a somewhat important factor in the lives of Ruth Hollister and other young women, I suddenly became of no account. New interests, new rivalries and loyalties had arisen in which I had no share. I must perforce busy myself with invoices of flour and coffee and canned fruits, while sleigh rides and coasting and skating expeditions to Blackstone Lake followed one another day after day, for the irony of circumstances had decreed a winter uncommonly cold. There were evening parties, too, where I felt like an alien, though my friends were guilty of no conscious neglect, and had I been able to accept the situation simply, I should not have suffered. The principal event of those holidays was a play given in the old Hambleton house, which later became the Boyne Club, under the direction of the lively and talented Mrs. Watling. I was invited, indeed, to participate, but even if I had had the desire I could not have done so, since the rehearsals were carried on in the daytime. Nancy was the leading lady. I have neglected to mention that she too had been away almost continuously since our misunderstanding, for the summer in the mountains, a sojourn recommended for her mother's health, and in the autumn she had somewhat abruptly decided to go east, to boarding school at Farmington. During the brief months of her absence she had marvellously acquired maturity and aplomb, a worldliness of manner and a certain frivolity that seemed to put those who surrounded her on a lower plane. She was only 17, yet she seemed the woman of 30 whose role she played. First there were murmurs, then sustained applause. I scarcely recognized her. She had taken wings and soared far above me, suggesting a sphere of power and luxury hitherto unimagined and beyond the scope of the world to which I belonged. Her triumph was genuine. When the play was over she was immediately surrounded by enthusiastic admirers, eager to congratulate her, to dance with her. I too would have gone forward, but a sense of inadequacy, of unimportance, of an inability to cope with her, held me back, and from a corner I watched her sweeping around the room, holding up her train and leaning on the arm of Bob Lansing, a classmate whom Ralph had brought home from Harvard. Then it was Ralph's turn. That affair seemed still to be going on. My feelings were a strange medley of despondency and stimulation. Our eyes met. Her partner now was Ham Durrett. Capriciously releasing him, she stood before me. "Hugh, you haven't asked me to dance or even told me what you thought of the play." "I thought it was splendid," I said lamely. Because she refrained from replying, I was farther than ever from understanding her. How was I to divine what she felt, or whether any longer she felt at all? Here, in this costume of a woman of the world, with the string of pearls at her neck to give her the final touch of brilliancy, was a strange new creature who baffled and silenced me. We had not gone halfway across the room when she halted abruptly. "I'm tired," she exclaimed. "I don't feel like dancing just now," and led the way to the big rose punch bowl, one of the Durretts' most cherished possessions. Glancing up at me over the glass of lemonade I had given her, she went on. "Why haven't you been to see me since I came home? I've wanted to talk to you, to hear how you are getting along." Was she trying to make amends, or reminding me in this subtle way of the cause of our quarrel? What I was aware of as I looked at her was an attitude, a vantage point apparently gained by contact with that mysterious outer world which thus vicariously had laid its spell on me. I was tremendously struck by the thought that to achieve this attitude meant emancipation, invulnerability against the aches and pains which otherwise our fellow beings had the power to give us, mastery over life, the ability to choose calmly, as from a height, what were best for oneself, untroubled by loves and hates. Untroubled by loves and hates! At that very moment, paradoxically, I loved her madly, but with a love not of the old quality, a love that demanded a vantage point of its own. even though she had made an advance, and some elusiveness in her manner led me to doubt it. I could not go to her now. I must go as a conqueror in the lists she herself had chosen, where the prize is power. "Oh, I'm getting along pretty well," I said. "At any rate, they don't complain of me." "Somehow," she ventured, "somehow it's hard to think of you as a business man." I took this for a reference to the boast I had made that I would go to college. "Business isn't so bad as it might be," I assured her. "I think a man ought to go away to college," she declared in what seemed another tone. "He makes friends, learns certain things. It gives him finish. We are very provincial here." Provincial! I did not stop to reflect how recently she must have acquired the word. It summed up precisely the self-estimate at which I had arrived. The sting went deep. Before I could think of an effective reply, Nancy was being carried off by the young man from the East, who was clearly infatuated. He was not provincial. She smiled back at me brightly over his shoulder. In that instant were fused in one resolution all the discordant elements within me of aspiration and discontent. It was not so much that I would show Nancy what I intended to do. I would show myself, and I felt a sudden elation and accession of power that enabled me momentarily to despise the puppets with whom she danced. From this mood I was awakened with a start, to feel a hand on my shoulder, and I turned to confront her father, Mackellarry Willett, a gregarious, easy-going, pleasure-loving gentleman who made only a pretence of business, having inherited an ample fortune from his father, unique among his generation in our city in that he paid some attention to fashion in his dress. Good living was already beginning to affect his figure. His mellow voice had a way of breaking an octave. "Don't worry, my boy," he said. "You stick to business. These college fellows are cocks of the walk just now, but some day you'll be able to snap your fingers at all of 'em." The next day was dark, overcast, smoky, damp, the soft, unwholesome dampness that follows a spell of hard frost. I spent the morning and afternoon on the gloomy third floor of Breck and Company, making a list of the stock. I remember the place as though I had just stepped out of it, the freight elevator at the back, the dusty iron columns, the continuous piles of cases and bags and barrels, with narrow aisles between them, the dirty windows, spotted and soot-streaked, that looked down on Second Street. I was determined now to escape from all this, and I had my plan in mind. No sooner had I swallowed my supper that evening than I set out at a swift pace for a modest residence district 10 blocks away, coming to a little frame house set back in a yard, one of those houses in which the ringing of the front door-bell produces the greatest commotion. Children's voices were excitedly raised and then hushed. After a brief silence, the door was opened by a pleasant-faced, brown-bearded man who stood staring at me in surprise. His hair was rumpled, he wore an old house-coat with a hole in the elbow, and with one finger he kept his place in the book which he held in his hand. "Hugh Paret!" he exclaimed. He ushered me into a little parlour lighted by 2 lamps that bore every evidence of having been recently vacated. Its features somehow bespoke a struggle for existence, as though its occupants had worried much and loved much. It was a room best described by the word home, home made more precious by a certain precariousness. Toys and school books strewed the floor, a sewing bag and apron lay across the sofa, and in one corner was a roll-topped desk of varnished oak. The seats of the chairs were comfortably depressed. So this was where Mr. Wood lived. Mr. Wood, instructor in Latin and Greek at Densmore Academy. It was now borne in on me for the first time that he did live and have his ties like any other human being, instead of just appearing magically from nowhere on a platform in a chalky room at 9 every morning, to vanish again in the afternoon. I had formerly stood in awe of his presence, but now I was suddenly possessed by an embarrassment and, shall I say it, by a commiseration bordering on contempt for a man who would consent to live thus for the sake of being a school-teacher. How strange that civilization should set such a high value on education and treat its functionaries with such neglect! Mr. Wood's surprise at seeing me was genuine, for I had never shown a particular interest in him, nor in the knowledge which he strove to impart. "I thought you had forgotten me, Hugh," he said, and added whimsically, "most boys do when they graduate." I felt the reproach, which made it the more difficult for me to state my errand. "I knew you sometimes took pupils in the evening, Mr. Wood." "Pupils, yes," he replied, still eyeing me. Suddenly his eyes twinkled. He had indeed no reason to suspect me of thirsting for learning. "But I was under the impression that you had gone into business, Hugh." "The fact is, sir," I explained somewhat painfully, "that I am not satisfied with business. I feel as if I ought to know more, and I came to see if you would give me lessons about 3 nights a week, because I want to take the Harvard examinations next summer." Thus I made it appear, and so persuaded myself, that my ambition had been prompted by a craving for knowledge. As soon as he could recover himself, he reminded me that he had on many occasions declared I had a brain. "Your father must be very happy over this decision of yours," he said. That was the point, I told him. It was to be a surprise for my father. I was to take the examinations first, and inform him afterwards. To my intense relief, Mr. Wood found the scheme wholly laudable, and entered into it with zest. He produced examinations of preceding years from a pigeon-hole in his desk, and inside of half an hour the arrangement was made, the price of the lessons settled. They were well within my salary, which recently had been raised. When I went downtown, or collecting bills for Breck and Company, I took a textbook along with me in the street cars. Now at last I had behind my studies a driving force. Algebra, Latin, Greek, and history became worthwhile, means to an end. I astonished Mr. Wood, and sometimes he would tilt back his chair, take off his spectacles, and pull his beard. "Why in the name of all the sages," he would demand, "couldn't you have done this well at school? You might have led your class, instead of Ralph Hambleton." I grew very fond of Mr. Wood, and even of his thin little wife, who occasionally flitted into the room after we had finished. I fully intended to keep up with them in after life, but I never did. I forgot them completely. My parents were not wholly easy in their minds concerning me. They were bewildered by the new aspect I presented, for my lately acquired motive was strong enough to compel me to restrict myself socially, and the evenings I spent at home were given to study, usually in my own room. Once I was caught with a Latin grammar. "I was just looking over it," I said. My mother sighed. I knew what was in her mind. She had always been secretly disappointed that I had not been sent to college. And presently, when my father went out to attend a trustees' meeting, the impulse to confide in her almost overcame me. I loved her with that affection which goes out to those whom we feel understand us, but I was learning to restrain my feelings. She looked at me wistfully. I knew that she would insist on telling my father, and thus possibly frustrate my plans. That I was not discovered was due to a certain quixotic twist in my father's character. I was working now, and though not actually earning my own living, he no longer felt justified in prying into my affairs. When June arrived, however, my tutor began to show signs that his conscience was troubling him, and one night he delivered his ultimatum. The joke had gone far enough, he implied. My intentions, indeed, he found praiseworthy, but in his opinion it was high time that my father were informed of them. He was determined to call at my father's office. The next morning was blue with the presage of showers, blue, too, with the presage of fate. An interminable morning. My tasks had become utterly distasteful, and in the afternoon, so when I sat down to make out invoices, I wrote automatically the names of the familiar customers, my mind now exalted by hope, now depressed by anxiety. The result of an interview, perhaps even now going on, would determine whether or no I should be immediately released from a slavery I detested. Would Mr. Wood persuade my father? If not, I was prepared to take more desperate measures. Remain in the grocery business I would not. In the evening, as I hurried homeward from the corner where the Boyne Street car had dropped me, I halted suddenly in front of the Peters house, absorbing the scene where my childhood had been spent. Each of these spreading maples was an old friend, and in these yards I had played and dreamed. An unaccountable sadness passed over me as I walked on toward our gate. I entered it, gained the doorway of the house, and went upstairs, glancing into the sitting-room. My mother sat by the window sewing. She looked up at me with an ineffable expression, in which I read a trace of tears. "Hugh!" she exclaimed. I felt very uncomfortable, and stood looking down at her. "Why didn't you tell us, my son?" In her voice was in truth reproach, yet mingled with that was another note, which I think was pride. "What has father said?" I asked. "Oh, my dear, he will tell you himself. I don't know. He will talk to you." Suddenly she seized my hands and drew me down to her, and then held me away, gazing into my face with a passionate questioning, her lips smiling, her eyes wet. What did she see? Was there a subtler relationship between our natures than I guessed? Did she understand, by some instinctive power, the riddle within me? Divine through love, the force that was driving me on she knew not whither, nor I. At the sound of my father's step in the hall she released me. He came in as though nothing had happened. "Well, Hugh, are you home?" he said. Never had I been more impressed, more bewildered by his self-command than at that time, save for the fact that my mother talked less than usual. Supper passed as though nothing had happened. Whether I had shaken him, disappointed him, or gained his reluctant approval, I could not tell. Gradually his outward calmness turned my suspense to irritation. But when at length we were alone together I gained a certain reassurance. His manner was not severe. He hesitated a little before beginning. "I must confess, Hugh, that I scarcely know what to say about this proceeding of yours. The thing that strikes me most forcibly is that you might have confided in your mother and myself." Hope flashed up within me, like an explosion. I wanted to surprise you, father, and then, you see, I thought it would be wiser to find out first how well I was likely to do at the examinations." My father looked at me. Unfortunately, he possessed neither a sense of humour nor a sense of tragedy sufficient to meet such a situation. For the first time in my life I beheld him at a disadvantage, for I had somehow managed at length to force him out of position, and he was puzzled. I was quick to play my trump card. "I have been thinking it over carefully," I told him, "and I have made up my mind that I want to go into the law." "The law?" he exclaimed sharply. "Why, yes, sir. I know that you were disappointed because I did not do sufficiently well at school to go to college and study for the bar." I felt indeed a momentary pang, but I remembered that I was fighting for my freedom. "You seemed satisfied where you were," he said in a puzzled voice. "And your cousin Robert gives a good account of you?" "I've tried to do the work as well as I could, sir," I replied, "but I don't like the grocery business or any other business. I have a feeling that I'm not made for it." "And you think now that you are made for the law?" he asked with the faint hint of a smile. "Yes, sir. I believe I could succeed at it. I'd like to try," I replied modestly. "You've given up the idiotic notion of wishing to be an author?" I implied that he himself had convinced me of the futility of such a wish. I listened to his next words as in a dream. "I must confess to you, Hugh, that there are times when I fail to understand you. I hope it is, as you say, that you have arrived at a settled conviction as to your future, and that this is not another of those caprices to which you have been subject, nor a desire to shirk honest work. Mr. Wood has made out a strong case for you, and I have therefore determined to give you a trial. If you pass the examinations with credit, you may go to college. But if at any time you fail to make good progress, you come home and go into business again. Is that thoroughly understood?" I said it was, and thanked him effusively. I had escaped. The prison doors had flown open. But it is written that every happiness has its sting, and my joy, intense though it was, had in it a core of remorse. I went downstairs to my mother, who was sitting in the hall by the open door. "Father says I may go," I said. She got up and took me in her arms. "My dear, I'm so glad, although we shall miss you dreadfully. Hugh?" "Yes, mother." "Oh, Hugh, I so want you to be a good man." Her cry was a little incoherent, but fraught with a meaning that came home to me, in spite of myself. A while later I ran over to announce to the amazed Tom Peters that I was actually going to Harvard with him. He stood in the half-lighted hallway, his hands in his pockets, blinking at me. "Hugh, you're a wonder!" he cried. "How in Jehoshaphat did you work it?" I lay long awake that night, thinking over the momentous change so soon to come into my life, wondering exultantly what Nancy Willett would say now. I was not one, at any rate, to be despised or neglected. End of section 5.